Okay. All right, does anybody have any questions over the first part of chapter 6? What we did on Monday. Stroke volume, Q, all that stuff makes sense. All right, then we're going to move on to looking at some of the rules that govern how blood flows through the body and the problems with plaque and cardiovascular disease. Okay, so the first rule that we have is a physical law. So if you've done physics at school or as a Gen Ed class, then you'll probably recognize this rule that matter, so it can be liquids, but it can also be gases, all right, flows from an area of high pressure or high concentration to an area of lower pressure or lower concentration. Okay? When we are looking at the cardiovascular system, the area of high pressure, the highest pressure is in the aorta and then the left ventricle. And the lowest pressure is in the veins and the right aorta. So that circular system that we discussed on Monday flows from high pressure leaving the left ventricle through the aortic valve into the aorta, round the body, back to the right aorta. Okay? Another rule that we have is that the rate of flow, so the speed or the amount of flow, is proportional to the pressure difference between two areas. All right? So that allows us to say that blood flow is the change in pressure, depending on what you're looking at, which resource you're looking at. The symbol for change is a triangle. So you might see triangle P, okay, divided by the resistance to the flow. How hard is it for the, in this case, blood to flow through the vessel? So then we can alter blood flow mathematically by doing one of these two things, all right? So we can increase the pressure difference, which occurs when we're exercising because of the stronger contraction of the heart muscle, okay? So I can increase the pressure difference, that increases blood flow. And or I can decrease the resistance to that blood flow, okay? So we do that by changing the radius of the blood vessels, particularly the arteries. All right. So by changing the radius of the artery, we have a very large impact on blood flow, a bigger impact than we can create because the change in pressure is controlled by how strongly the heart muscle can contract. But the resistance to flow, our body can open up many, many vessels to the muscle and increase blood flow. Okay, so both these things occur during exercise. Another way we could do it, if we take the pressure difference between two ends of a vessel, we could lengthen the vessel. Well, that doesn't happen unless we're growing. Once we're adults, that doesn't really happen very much, except around the capillary bed where we add more capillaries. Right? We could look at the fact that if I'm dehydrated, then that would increase viscosity and that would increase resistance to blood flow. So maintaining hydration helps the resistance. Right? So controlling the radius of the blood vessels allows for the central nervous system to direct blood flow to the organs that need it at that time. We'll come back to that idea in a minute. We've got a nice diagram to show us that idea. Okay? I'm going to come back to this picture on the next slide because I want to mention our blood pressures first. All right, so last week in lab, we measured blood pressure, all right? And we mentioned the fact that normotensive is now considered less than 120 over less than 80. Okay? High normal, 120 to 139 over 80 to 89. And then we have two levels of hypertension. And you'll often see high normal called pre-hypertensive, right? Depending on what you're reading, because they want to pick this up as quickly as possible before it gets worse, all right? So our level 1 hypertension, moderate hypertension, 140 to 159 over 90 to 99. It's very important if you are going to set training programs for anybody and they tell you that they have hypertension, that you identify whether they are moderate or high, right? Because it impacts the program you should be planning for that person, okay? People with high-level hypertension, depending on how high it is once we hit this number, may actually be put on bed rest in a hospital because at some point it's so high you can't tackle it through lifestyle interventions, right? It's not safe, okay? So what might be some of the reasons for this hypertension, right? Well, when we're training, we see increases in blood pressure, right? But that's because we increase cardiac output, and so now we're squeezing a larger amount of liquid into the same size, basically the same size vessel. And then we have to increase the radius of the vessels to try to help out. Right? If we do aerobic work, it really helps with this picture because the more aerobic work I do, the higher the capacitance of the arteries. Capacitance is the fancy word for elasticity. So the arteries become more stretchy and therefore have more give, and so putting that extra fluid into them doesn't raise blood pressure so much. Right? Then we have the reverse problem, hardening of the arteries. So if I go back to this previous picture, right? This is a very simple diagram of plaque buildup. But what plaque basically does, if you're laying down plaques on the insides of your arteries, basically what you are doing is reducing the radius gradually of the artery. Even if it doesn't close over completely and block the artery, you've still reduced the radius quite considerably and therefore increased the resistance to blood flow. And that increases blood pressure. Okay? So we see some acute change in blood pressure at the time of the exercise, but we are also able to obtain some chronic training effects, which is very beneficial, okay? So in the immediate sense, if you do aerobic work, your systolic pressure increases, but your diastolic pressure stays relatively stable. Wobbles a little bit, but not very much, all right? So that will often be used as a diagnostic tool, right? If you're on a stress test, you're on a treadmill or a bike, and then monitoring your heart rate and your blood pressure, and your diastolic pressure starts going up when you're doing something aerobic, they're going to stop you straight away and send you for further testing, right? Because your diastolic pressure just should not change. Doing resistance work, though, is a very different picture, right? When we do any kind of resistance exercise, particularly if we add weight to it, but even without the weight, just doing body squats and press-ups, we see large increases in both pressures, systolic and diastolic. And so that's a key point when you're setting these training programs and someone tells you they have hypertension. Right? If they are normo or moderately hypertensive, then you can have them do some resistance work. If they're normal, obviously you can have them lift weights. If they're moderately hypertensive, then you should probably stick to something like body weight or band work or using a yoga ball, something like that, okay? If you have someone who is diagnosed with high blood pressure, you do not give them resistance work until their blood pressure comes down, right? Think about what you see. I mentioned this last Thursday. If you go down into a gym and you watch someone pushing a really heavy weight, right? What do you physically see happen in their face and their arms and their neck? Big red, and you see big bulging blood vessels, right? Because you're squeezing so hard. When you squeeze the muscle, you shut down all the blood vessels, right? And so the amount of pressure that builds up in the system is substantial. In resistance work, someone who's lifting something really, really heavy, they've seen things as high as 300, 320 over 200, 250. Huge changes in pressure, right? Well, if someone has hypertension and you do that to them, they're going to keel over and you're going to be in a lot of trouble, right? When you do this aerobic work, as I said, you don't see very much change in systolic, diastolic. Systolic could go up to around 200 or so. That would be considered just normal for that type of exercise. Okay. So the chronic changes that we see in blood pressure can be very beneficial, and it's one of the reasons why more and more doctors and clinicians are trying to get people with blood pressure issues to take more physical activity, because whether we do aerobic or weight training, we see a drop in resting blood pressure. Now, the mechanisms for the drop in resting blood pressure are a little bit different, depending on whether the work was aerobic or resistance. But a drop in resting blood pressure is great, because then when I add in the extra blood pressure for the training, I'm still looking at an overall lower blood pressure for that individual, right? So you can see it drop up to 10 millimeters of mercury, which is quite useful for some of these individuals. Also, if their resting blood pressure is down, we're likely to see lower submax blood pressures. So while they're exercising, their blood pressure will be lower than it was previously. Okay. And as I said, important is that aerobic training increases the elasticity. The more elastic because plaque hardens the arteries. It turns solid over time, and it's stuck to the wall of the artery, and so the artery becomes basically hard and can't change size to help with the blood pressure problem. So the stretchier, the more elastic we can make our arteries, the better off we are. Right? It's another reason why, it's easy to say this now, when I was your age I didn't do it, but it's another reason why we shouldn't just lift. Right? We should do a combined lifting and aerobic program. Okay? Because lifting doesn't improve capacitance. And in the long run, that capacitance is really, really important when we start looking at various cardiovascular diseases. Okay? I didn't, as I said. All I did was lift. Forever. Right? And I got into my 30s and went, yeah, I better do something about this. So in the textbook, they have a really nice summary table. Be aware that we're looking at resting adaptation. So there might be some difference when you're looking at submax or max exercise, all right? But it kind of summarizes what we can get from doing aerobic work or from doing resistance type work. I think that's quite a useful table to pay attention to, because it saves you hiking all the way through all the writing unless you want to. Okay. Uh-oh. There's my in-betweeny bit gone. Oh no. Wait, I'm missing some slides here. Hang on. Is that because I put two? Yes. It lost some slides. What did it do with them? What happened to slides 1, 2, and 3? That's what I don't know. Okay, hold on. All right, we'll go back to the collaborate in a minute because collaborate swallowed some of the slides. So quick discussion on red blood cells. Again, hopefully this is review, and you did this in AMP. Red blood cells are responsible for moving oxygen around the bloodstream, and the oxygen sits on a molecule called hemoglobin within a red blood cell, and hemoglobin contains iron. So now we have a link between nutritional substance that we need to make sure we have within our diet and our capacity to perform aerobic work. All right? The more hemoglobin, the more red blood cells we have, the greater the oxygen carrying capacity is. And that idea will come back when we look at altitude work. Okay? In adults, red blood cells are made in the bone marrow in our long bones. So you may know someone, or you may have read about people that have to have bone marrow transplants because their bone marrow isn't functioning correctly, or they've got cancer in there, and they need to have a transplant so that they can make red blood cells and provide oxygen to their body. Okay? So red blood cells are odd in that they don't have a nucleus that gets taken away as they're formed, And so they're not able to repair themselves. So they have a finite lifespan. They last about 12 to 16 weeks. And then they break down and they get reabsorbed, and that iron gets used to make some more red blood cells. Okay. So in athletes, particularly aerobic athletes, aerobic training increases the number of red blood cells that you have over time. It also increases blood plasma levels. So for endurance athletes, they have much higher blood volumes than a sedentary person, which means they've got this massive benefit for carrying oxygen around the system. Okay? So, the plasma volume, so the plasma is all the watery bit of the blood. And then you've got red blood cells, you've got platelets, you've got white blood cells, all being carried around in this plasma. And plasma is about 90% or something water, it's really high levels of water, which means if you're dehydrated, you can reduce your plasma volume, make it harder to do aerobic work. Okay? When we start, so an acute, again, on the day that I'm training, okay, so an acute effect on blood plasma volume is that if I'm working at a high level, we're going to see a short-term reduction in plasma volume, okay, which seems back to front, but what happens is I've got this extra red blood cells, I've got the extra oxygen. If I reduce the volume, I've got more oxygen per volume measure than I had before. So in a weird way, by reducing plasma volume in the short term, we increase oxygen capacity. It's a little bizarre, right? If I do a really long, hard session of aerobic work, we can see quite substantial decreases in plasma volume, particularly if it's hot and humid. Right? So you have to be particularly careful to make sure that you're ready to rehydrate if you're going to be training that kind of work in that kind of environment. Right? If we're weight training, again, particularly if it's hot and humid, we can see similar levels of plasma reduction. Okay. So athletes can be, if they take some blood work, then they may identify an athlete as having anemia, when actually what's happened is their plasma volume over time has increased, and it makes it look like their red blood cells are thin, when actually it's that they've got all this additional plasma volume, because the chronic effect of training is an increase in plasma volume. Okay. Back to our table. So let's go back to the I'll do that one. Alright, so where are we? Plasma volume at rest for an aerobic athlete is increased. Right? So they have much higher blood volumes for carrying this oxygen around and being able to make ATP aerobically. We don't see that same change in plasma volume with a strength athlete. So chronically, we looked at the acute, the chronic effect is that we see increased cardiac output during an aerobic workout. Right? We don't see an increased cardiac output in the same way in resistance work that we do in aerobic work, but the heart, because the heart gets so strong because it's working against this massive blood pressure, the heart becomes more capable of maintaining Q against these high blood pressures that we see when we're lifting weights. So we start to see a difference depending on whether I'm doing endurance work or I'm doing weight training type activities. All right? Okay. So what happens when we're exercising? How do we get, we've established that we get more oxygen, we expand the blood vessels so we can get more blood to the working muscle, okay? How do we get the oxygen out of the blood and into the muscle? Because it's no good to us in the bloodstream. Right? It's all very well having more red blood cells and higher levels of hemoglobin, but I don't make ATP within the bloodstream. Right? So I have to be able to get that oxygen out of the bloodstream and into the muscle tissue. Okay? And one of the mechanisms that is used is this rather ugly term here, arterial venous oxygen difference. So it's shortened to AVO2 difference, which is a lot easier, okay? But it is exactly what it says. It's the difference in oxygen level between the veins that are leaving the muscle and the arteries that are coming into the muscle. Okay? So let me turn this light off because it's horrible trying to see anything on this board. So, we have the artery coming in on the left, right? We're going to assume that capillary is wrapping around the muscle because that's really the organ that we're the most interested in at this point, right? We want to deliver oxygen to the muscles so we can exercise. And then these are the veins leaving the muscle carrying blood back to the heart. So, on a given day, at rest, I've got 20 milliliters of oxygen per 100 milliliters of blood, on average, right? Depends on the person. But in this example, and when I look at the level of oxygen in the vein that is leaving the muscle, I have about 15 milliliters of oxygen. Okay. That means that I lost 5 here, right? So at rest, 5 milliliters of oxygen transferred out of the bloodstream into the muscle tissue. Okay. Then this person goes and exercises. Right? Well, on a given day, I don't get more red blood cells, I don't get more blood plasma, or I don't get more hemoglobin, right? So on this day, this person still has 20 milliliters of oxygen per 100 ml. Right? When I look at the oxygen in the vein, however, it's down to 5. So now I have an AVO2 difference of 15 milliliters of oxygen that left the bloodstream and entered the muscle tissue. That's all that is saying, right? They use this big fancy term and freak everybody out, and that's all it's telling you. How much oxygen left the bloodstream and entered the tissue. Okay? Usually when we look at AVO2 difference, we tend to consider the body as a whole. You have to have very sophisticated equipment to measure it. You have to have even more sophisticated equipment to measure a particular muscle, right? So typically when you're reading about it, they're talking about all your muscles, right? But just keep thinking about, why do I need oxygen, right? I have to have oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain to pick up those hydrogen ions so that we do not get an acidic environment and therefore we don't get fatigued. Right? So when I'm working aerobically, I can keep going for hours and hours and hours and hours because the pH level in the muscle stays relatively stable. Right? As long as I can get oxygen in and turn the hydrogens into water, I can keep the pH level stable. Okay? So, if we're going to measure oxygen delivery, right now, how much oxygen is being delivered, we're going to use a similar equation to the one that we used for Q. Okay? Remember that Q is basically blood delivery per minute to the body, right? How much blood is squirted out of the heart per minute. So, oxygen delivery is blood flow, how much blood I have, multiplied by AVO2 difference, how much oxygen is removed. So, oxygen consumption, oxygen delivery, we call VO2. Right? VO2 is Q, blood flow, how much blood is coming out, multiplied by how much oxygen is being removed. Remember that Q is heart rate times stroke volume, so we can expand it to this. And our VO2, we can use a percentage of our VO2 max as an intensity measure if we want to. Our VO2 max, everybody's got that plateau for their VO2, okay, that is genetically determined, right? So how much oxygen I can consume at the tissue level is genetically determined, but I can measure it using this idea. Right? So that means that if I want to, when we see improvements in VO2 and VO2 max, then I can increase Q, right? Or I can increase how much oxygen is removed from the blood, or a combination thereof. So, when we talk about increasing Q, we come back to this idea of diverting blood flow. all right? Because if I want to increase blood flow to a muscle, I can't create more blood. I have to take it from somewhere else in the body to increase the flow to a muscle. Does that make sense? Right? So if I want to increase oxygen consumption by that muscle, I have to increase Q and or increase how much oxygen is being taken away. So how can I increase blood flow to a working muscle?
It's 10 times.
Okay. This is... Let me do one more slide. 22, right? So, at rest, this bottom line here is resting state, and the top line, the red line, is heavy exercising state, right? So when we're looking here, we said on Monday that Q at rest is about 5 liters. Remember, we looked at that bottle, right? 5 liters per minute. So when I'm at rest, 5 liters is coming out per minute. About a quarter of that blood flow is going to my stomach and my colon. Okay. About 5% is going to my heart. 20% is going to my kidneys. 5% to my bones. About 15% to my brain. About 5% to my skin. And around 15 to 20% to my muscles, because they are working. The postural muscles are working. Your heart muscle is still working. Your wrist, your finger, your forearm muscles are working, right? So you still need some blood flow. When we do high intensity or heavy, hard work, then Q can go up between 20 to 40. So in this example, they use 25 liters per minute. Okay? Now what we see is a drop to just 5% of that blood flow going to our stomach. So this is the major reason why you shouldn't eat something big and heavy before you exercise, because your central nervous system is going to take the blood flow from your stomach and your digestive organs and move it to your muscles. Because if you're running away from a tiger, it does not matter whether you digest your food unless you become tiger food, right? So it moves the blood away from your stomach, okay? Heart is still only about 5%. And you might say, well, that's weird because my heart's having to work so hard now, it needs all that extra blood and oxygen. But remember, it's 5% of 25, not 5% of 5. So it's getting a lot more blood flow. Okay? Kidneys drops down to about 4%. So something you might notice the next time you go for a long run or a bike ride is that you don't need to go for a pee, because your kidneys stop making urine while you're exercising really hard, right? A little bit to your bones. Again, we see a drop to the brain down to 3 to 4%, but remember, it's 3 to 4% of 25, and we have to drop that down because there's very little room inside your cranium, right? And brain tissue is extremely delicate. You can't suddenly have a rush of blood into small little blood vessels that's going to put a ton of pressure onto the brain, right? So we have to drop the percentage of blood to the brain so that it maintains what we need, so it's actually the same We can't have more. All that extra blood flow, some of it goes to the skin because we've got to release heat, and 70% plus now goes to your working muscles. All right? So we're going to come back to that and talk about how does that happen on Friday. So check my adding up as always. Don't take these away, please. I have not logged them. Everybody got one? Too many talk to me's, but if I did have a talk to me or a question, come find me tomorrow morning or Friday morning in office hours, or this afternoon if you're free.
Oh, be there.
Yeah.